So I'm pleased to now be able to introduce my partner, Simon Cohen, from our patents team in London. So Simon has been stoking the fire since first thing this morning by his fireside. I'm imagining you in a wing-back chair, Simon, and I'll hand over to you to introduce our guest. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Alison. Yes, well, it's good news to report. The fire is burning nicely behind me. And I hope, George, you're feeling the warmth of the fire. We're coming from North London out to Cambridge.
I can feel it, Simon.
Good news. Thanks, Alison. Absolutely delighted to introduce our good friend, George Moore. George is Assistant General Counsel for Europe in terms of IP and IP litigation at Viatris. Hope I pronounced that correctly. But let me give you a little bit of perspective on George, because I think he's had a really interesting career, which gives him a unique or very good perspective on the pharmaceutical industry and the patents sphere within the pharmaceutical industry. Although he doesn't look old enough, believe it or not, having checked his CV, he started in law about 20 years ago when he did his training and was an associate and worked as a lawyer at Bristow's and Allen & Overy. From there, he has had a number of in-house jobs. He started out at Apotex in Canada. Then he went to Sandoz in Holzkirchen, then on to Mylan, who recently became Viatris. So as I said, I think what's interesting about George, unlike some of us, is he's had this varied private practice and industry experience, and he's seen the world of pharmaceuticals from different companies. So I'm really looking forward to asking you, George, a few questions. I think we've got about half an hour. So if it's okay, I'm going to kick off. The first question, George, is both of us are sort of old enough to remember the old days where there was a real polarization between the generic companies and the so-called brand companies. And if I even remember in the old days, people used to say, if you act for one side of the industry, you can't act for the other. There was quite a lot of emotive talk at the time. I think a lot of that is going away. And of course, now there are companies like Viatris, your own company, which is a brand company with a mixture of brand and generic drugs, and plenty of other companies. There's also the sort of biosimilar products coming onto the market. The divisions seem to be blurring. And what I want to ask you really, George, is do you think this distinction between generic and brand companies will continue to fall away? And will there be sort of no such distinction at all in maybe 5 or 10 years?
So thanks, Simon. And firstly, thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to join you today. So distinction between brand and generic companies. I mean, one thing is clear. There'll always be originator products and generic products because there will always be innovation. And there's that desire and need to bring new things to the market, and the way that we have of incentivizing that innovation is through the patent system. And by virtue of having a patent system, the minute that anyone files a patent that they on a pharmaceutical product, they will know that in 20 years time that product then becomes generic. There will always be an on patent sector and an off patent sector. So there will always be generic products, and there will always be new originator products coming on as well. The question is as to where those products sit in particular businesses. And I think if you look over the last 20 years, yes, I think certainly 20 years ago, there was a clear distinction between originator companies and generic companies. And I think over the last 20 years, you've had a kind of a period of consolidation with large pharma companies getting bigger and consolidating various different pieces of the businesses all into kind of big conglomerates. And that was certainly the kind of the period that took place between 2000 and around the kind of the just after 2010. I think what we've seen since then, you kind of almost the concertina is kind of falling back a bit, but in a slightly different way. And what the big originators who kind of got big are kind of slimming down a little bit and really focusing in on the kind of originated products alone, and the real advances in science that bring them beyond just manufacturing products alone and then bringing those to market, but looking at different ways of healthcare, such as gene therapy. So that's the direction that they're going in, and they're kind of shedding their kind of the older, mature parts of their businesses, and we're seeing lots of companies who are doing that. So, for example, Pfizer shared the Upjohn business, which is now merged together with Mylan to become Viatris. Merck's doing the same thing. Merck is shedding Organon. That's been announced quite recently. It was only this week that Emma Walmsley from GSK was talking about how the GSK itself is going to change and start to break up over the next couple of years. And you're seeing similar types of changes as well. So at the same time, the generic businesses have got really big. And in order to keep that growth going, they've the big generic companies have moved into kind of originator and mature products. So if you look at kind of the three biggest generic players in the world, which is essentially Teva, Sandoz, and what was Mylan, they're not necessarily pure generic companies at all. So Teva is a big originator company with a massive generic arm as well. It's the same for Viatris because we've come together with Upjohn, and Sandoz is part of the big Novartis group as well. So that change has happened over the years. Where do we go from here? I think that change is going to continue. I think because of price pressure on the generic business overall, and the pressure that creates in the market, I think that the need for growth means that I don't think you'll find big generic companies just being big generic companies alone. That's the way I see it going. And I think that there will be that need to consolidate to get that global scale, and to join together with mature product businesses. I think we are seeing that.
Thanks, George. Can I sort of home in on biosimilars, which I've always been intrigued about? Biosimilars seem to buck the trend, as I was saying before, in that the generic companies make biosimilars, the brand companies make biosimilars, not just as the brand.
Yeah.
Are all companies capable of making biosimilars correctly, accurately? And the reason I ask that is, it seems to have a link to the COVID situation, where there's a suggestion that we should waive patents. That's another issue. But it always struck me, well, it's all very well waiving patents, but do a number of these companies actually have the capability, are able to get regulatory approval and have the right manufacturing procedures to actually effectively make good quantities of biosimilars?
So there's lots of organizations that make biosimilars, from the large to the small. The question then is selling them, and many of the biosimilar product launches that there have been, the products are treated as branded products. That they're not just like commodity products that are sold in the same way as commodity generics are sold. They're sold with sales forces, and they are marketed. So that requires them to have the bigger muscle that you sometimes see having only being present in the larger pharma companies. Now, whether or not that home for biosimilars sits then, or marketing biosimilars sits in the generic side of the business, or sits in the originator side of the business, it seems to be quite open at the moment. There are some originators who've kind of taken biosimilars and incorporated into their business, like Pfizer has with Aspira. When there are some originators like Merck who did get into the biosimilar business by doing deals with certain manufacturers, but that's now being split out into a different business. Certainly from Mylan's perspective, we have a number of biosimilars that we sell around the world and have been quite successful in doing so, but we partner with a number of manufacturers to get that manufacturing done. And I know that there are, let's say, other companies on this call who are much smaller players. I kind of say that with respect, but they are, perfectly good biosimilar manufacturers as well. But it's the question of whether or not they're going to be able to get that global sale to truly market them all around the world.
Thanks, George. Okay, can I turn sort of away from the general to a slightly more specific topic? We heard a session earlier on about preliminary injunction practice, and we heard the talks from the various European countries. Matt Royal spoke about the neuromelatonin case, which is obviously one of yours. I'm not going to say anything specific about that. But one of the issues I thought was interesting from that is the fact that Mr. Justice Marcus Smith started to change the view that had been, again, prominent for many years, that there would be a irreversible price crash if generics launched, and therefore favoured granting preliminary injunctions. This is very different, as we all know. It's this sort of commercial approach that they take in the UK from the approach taken outside the UK in continental Europe. Do you see this as an issue that, you know, merits are obviously very important in Germany and the Netherlands, commercial issues less important, whereas the opposite is the case in the UK, where merits are of minor importance, you just have to show an arguable case. And it's the commercial factors which are the big question. Does that create issues for a company like Viatris and similar companies? And do you think it would be? Do you think there's any possibility to harmonise? And do you think that the situation would be improved if there was harmonisation in the approach to PIs?
So just a couple of comments. I mean, I'll start with comments about, let's say, the generic side and the kind of just the perspective that the generic side of the business has. When looking to do launches of generic products, launching at risk is a fact of life in a competitive business. So there are going to be occasions where you're going to want to launch on the market and then fight off the PI. That's just the nature of the business. And picking up on the point that Alison made at the end of the last talk, all of the practical implications of the law are different in different jurisdictions. So, for example, the system we have on preliminary injunctions in the UK is different to that in Germany that Christoph deals with, and different to that in Belgium that Christian will deal with as well, and they are different all over Europe. And my job and the job of our team is to understand and to navigate those differences all across Europe. So, take for example the Nuri and Mylan case that we had on melatonin. That was a launch at risk in the face of a patent which had been held invalid at first instance by the EPO. Now, that opened the door when we launched in the UK. That ended up into a PI battle, both at first instance on appeal, that cost a great deal of money. If, for example, we'd been fighting that battle in a different European jurisdiction, many European countries wouldn't even consider granting a PI at all because of what had happened at the EPO for the first instance. So that makes the situation in the UK completely different than many other European countries. It's not alone. The UK system is quite similar to that in Ireland and Australia, for example, but it certainly makes it different than some of the continental European countries. However, I think a lot of our considerations from our perspective depend upon what type of products that we're dealing with. Just because that was the experience on that particular product doesn't mean the UK's got it wrong. For example, we were launching a biosimilar a couple of years ago in Germany, and we worked together with Christoph and his team in Germany, and we got injuncted like that from the German court for particular circumstances. We launched the same biosimilar in the UK, and because of the way in which the rules on preliminary injunctions happen in the UK, we knew that there was no chance they would ever apply for a PI at all, and they haven't even sued us in the UK for the launch of that biosimilar. So it's horses for courses, really, and the rules apply to different circumstances in different ways. And that can work for good or ill, depending on what the product is and depending on what we're trying to do. But equally, I mean, as you mentioned at the top of the call, at Viatris, we work on both sides. We also have our branded business, whereby sometimes the boot's on the other foot, and we're enforcing our patents against generic launches in particular markets around the world. And again, it's not for me to say that the system is better or worse in the UK. It's just different, and that difference means different things in different circumstances.
Yeah, I'm not that I understand that. I suppose that the problem is that because of the differences, you need people like you running the patents group in pharmaceutical companies, and it puts smaller companies at a disadvantage because the systems are so different, like the biosimilar you referred to, you know, injuncted in one place, not even thought about it in another. I mean, it does make it complicated, doesn't it, for the smaller players? It may be okay for the Viatrises and the big companies because, you know, you've got a big sophisticated plan, but it's not helpful, is it, for the smaller generic company?
Just picking up on your point, I mean, you know, going to your point was, would there ever be harmonization? I mean, yes, in an ideal world, harmonization of all the systems would be great. But, you know, any look at the attempts that there have been to try and bring in that harmonization in Europe alone through the UPC, that's hit so many stumbling blocks that, you know, we're not even talking about that today because of, we've all been through all those stumbling blocks before. But, you know, I think harmonization would be nice, but it's not going to happen. There are always going to be differences on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. And, you know, people will look to capitalize on that or exploit those differences for good or ill, depending on which side of the business you're in.
Which does favour the slightly more sophisticated players, I think. I mean, without wanting to sound political about it, but if you can fall and stop and work your strategy out, bearing in mind exactly how different courts are going to react, it just puts the bigger, stronger company in a slightly better position, possibly.
Maybe that's the case with all businesses, that, you know, the bigger you are, the more experience you've got, and the bigger coverage that you've got, and being able to ride out the ups and downs in different markets.
Yeah. Okay, I'd like to turn to the future now, George, and talk about any particular reform that you would like in an ideal world, any reforms of the patent system, particularly as it pertains to the pharmaceutical world, any particular bugbears that you would like to fix if you were a legislator in maybe in Europe or in one of the key European countries. One of the hot topics that's often discussed is that of divisionals, the fact that patentees can, and I say this in hopefully sort of an unbiased way, but patentees can let parent applications lapse or withdraw them, and let divisionals come through and then assert them, so that the parents are unchallenged and they have the ability to assert them and enforce them. And there have been various well recorded examples where divisionals have been used to good effect by the patentees. What I want to ask you is, you know, how much of a problem is this for pharmaceutical companies? Obviously, the ones who are on the receiving end of the divisionals, not the ones asserting them. And would you, in an ideal world, like something to be done about it?
Yeah. So, just picking up on your bugbears, I'll deal first with divisionals. The second point I was going to come on to was just talking about data exclusivity challenges, so I can come on to that in a minute. But first, divisionals, yes. I think, and I think many others do, that the divisional patent system, as has been abused and is being abused in Europe. I won't go into the mechanics of why. I think that's been well trodden in another fora. The problem that I and many others have with the divisional patent system at the moment is that the way that it's being abused is that it doesn't really seem at its heart to be protecting innovation. I mean, we, and I think others, want to see a strong, robust patent system that truly rewards innovation, so that new innovative products can be brought to the market and get the relevant protections that they need. However, the way in which the divisional patent system seems to be gamed on occasions in Europe with respect to pharmaceutical products, with cascades of divisional patents, with shielding of patents from decisions by withdrawing them just before a technical board of appeal decision or a key opposition division decision, in order to essentially extend the enforceable life of invalid rights, is a problem. It is being investigated at the moment by the European Commission in one particular case. Medicines for Europe, which is the industry body on the generic side of the business has written to the European Commission about it, and has got a position paper out about it as well, and has written to the EPO about it as well. I'm not convinced that the EPO will do something about it, but it's quite clear that this is a problem for the generic side of the business, and I don't think it's easy to defend from the originator side of the business, because I don't think the problem in the system is that what is being done is truly protecting truly innovative work. I think it's being used as a tactic in order to delay generic entry rather unfairly. So coming to your second point, other bugbear.
Just on that, I guess to close it off, and I agree with you. It's sort of difficult to see what the EPO can do about it. Which, I mean, it does seem to be a shame, doesn't it? Because there've been so many well-worn examples of it. I mean, is competition law, antitrust, the way to at least keep it in check, do you think?
I think certainly antitrust law is looking at it, but we all know that antitrust law does take a while for it to come to a conclusion on the answer. In the meantime, there's a lot of dialogue that needs to happen with people like the Commission and the EPO about the effects of divisionals, and there are changes that the EPO should need to do in order to right the wrongs in the system. I mean, don't forget, back in 2008, in the original Pharma inquiry from the European Commission did back in 2008, one of the recommendations in the preliminary report was to change the patent system on divisionals because it was being abused. And they did change it, but then they changed it back a couple of years later, and lo and behold, here we are in 2021 talking about the abuse of the divisional patent system in Europe. So something needs to be done, and it's clear, by looking back at the paperwork from the last 10-15 years, that something does need to be done about it.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, George. You were going to talk about data exclusivity and, again, ideas for reform.
So just briefly, this is more just in the kind of bucket of bugbears that you asked for. There needs to be fora for companies to both obtain and then defend their exclusivity rights that they get. Most of our work that we do with you, Simon, and which Wessing does with us is on patents and patent litigation. But you've also done some great work for us on data exclusivity challenges. One thing that we have found is that trying to get the relevant mechanics of a data exclusivity challenge up and running in Europe are difficult. The routes for doing so aren't easy, and they are beset with problems of a procedural nature that kind of slow down the resolution of these matters. We've found that on a couple of products over the last couple of years, and I think other companies have found that too. That's not a particular generic perspective. That's just saying that there needs to be a sensible forum for companies resolving their disputes on data exclusivity that allow almost that kind of adversarial procedure with arguments to be taken, that's not just done behind closed doors at a regulator. And I think that needs to be looked at, because I think a lot of, let's say, exclusivity rights are being granted and not having the right spotlight being shone on them to allow them to be challenged or examined in a proper way, in the way that we have a court system or an EPO system whereby validity of patents are thrashed out in a let's say predictable way for good or ill.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem strange, doesn't it? It all seems rather opaque, really. That you can't get at the gist of exactly what what's being looked at. They're these very tight deadlines, aren't they? To apply for judicial review, 2 months, I think, in the Europe, and 3 months for UKJR, and it does all seem to be very much stacked against the applicant for judicial review, and to protect the assessors.
Sure.
I can see why the assessors have to be protected to an extent, because there'll be a lot of challenges, but the balance doesn't really seem to be right. As you say, it's completely different with patents, where you can challenge the invalidity of a patent to the hilt as many times as you like, in as many countries and as many fora.
And quite often the rights that are provided by data exclusivity are particularly powerful, and rightly so when they're granted in the right circumstances. I mean, truly innovative work and clinical trial work that is done to bring new products to the market is really important, and that work should be protected. But when there are instances where it's not quite clear whether or not data exclusivity should be awarded or not, the routes for challenging that are tricky.
Yeah, and it's amazing. It's I mean, thank you for referring to the work that we do together. But it almost seems to me there are so few cases.
Yeah.
It almost seems to me, I don't know whether the industry is aware of the fact that you can challenge these grants, because it's such a short period of time. Unless you're quick off the mark, you've got to put in upfront pleadings. You've got to state your case like you have to do in European patent cases. It's not an easy job, and I suppose I wonder whether it's partly an information issue, where the information isn't out there. That people are alert to the fact that they've just got to be watching it. It may partly be that they're granted not at the right time of the product cycle, so that product life cycle, so that you're not thinking of a generic launch when the original data exclusivity is granted. I don't know. I mean, the timing may be off a bit.
There is that point. I mean, it's people do on the generic side of the industry do look very, very far ahead, and it's their job, our job, to be looking at products even before the originators are actually getting them approved. You've got to be thinking that hard, so your business is planning for 15 years, 20 years ahead, and it's natural that you do that. And certainly Viatris or the Mylan side of the business has certainly been doing that for many, many years with our big stable of oppositions that we do at the EPO. So you do have to be thinking forward, and I don't think that's a reason not to do it. I think it's just that the procedural routes for doing so are tricky, and I don't think we've got that quite right in Europe at the moment.
Thanks, George. I can see we're at 11:29. I don't know whether, Alison, we've got time for one maybe final little question. I think we may have started a minute or two late, so I think that you may allow it. Just about COVID, really, I referred to it earlier. The whole discussion about patents and waivers, are they all a red herring? The politicians are getting very excited about them, about patent waivers, but I don't really see the relevance, because no patents have been asserted, and patents or no patents, you've got to actually make the stuff. And I know it's gone through the various regulators quite quickly, but again, going back to the point about manufacturing capability, not particularly straightforward. I mean, would you be able to produce a vaccine in a couple of months if there were no patent issues, George?
I certainly wouldn't.
You worked for a year at SmithKline. I see on your CV you've got some chemistry experience.
Well, chemistry experience a long time ago, Simon. On the issue of COVID waivers, I think, and I think many others think, that's the real issue for, let's say, lack of supply to other markets. It's not an IP issue. I think it's more to do with supply chains and actually supply capability and manufacturing capability. I mean, one of the things that we see in our business is one of the most important things is to making sure that you can actually have the manufacturing capability to bring a product to market. And sometimes you see comments from judges thinking, oh, you can just manufacture, it's all very easy. It's not. You've got huge numbers of professional people with factories that run night and day that do a great deal to provide life-saving medicines to patients, and working out and running those businesses is not an easy task. So the world doesn't have, let's say, stacks of vaccine manufacturing capability just sitting there idling, waiting to suddenly to pull a switch and then say, right, let's manufacture the world's supply of COVID vaccines. You just don't have it. So I think most important thing is get that manufacturing base sorted out first of all, and work out what's going to happen. And we've seen in Europe that the difficulties that certain companies have had in terms of meeting the demand that people want for those vaccines. And that's not to take away the huge effort that certain companies have done to get those vaccines out so far. It's been fantastic to see. I think that the industry's done very, very well for itself in terms of providing that the resource for the world at this crucial time. But I think patent waivers is missing the point, really.
Thanks, George, for that and for the whole discussion, which I found really interesting. I hope everyone else has. Alison, can I hand back to you in the studio?
Thank you very much, Simon and George. Thank you so much for your thoughts and wisdom. Absolutely fascinating discussion. And Simon, I'll let you continue stoking your fire for the next fireside chat.